Luke's account of the birth of Jesus not only contradicts the account in the Gospel of Matthew, it contradicts itself. This is where Luke is contradicting itself. Let's take a look at a contradiction in the Bible, that it's not impossible to harmonize the contradiction. No contradictions in the Bible. They're not actually impossible that the Bible has zero contradictions. About one of these contradictions, proposed contradiction.
Dan McClellan is making his rounds as this anti-apologetics scholar. And when he's not critiquing apologists, he just in general will critique major positions within Christianity. In a recent video series, he takes what he perceives as a major contradiction within the New Testament, within Luke, and he unravels this apparent contradiction. And he also coincides that with one take from a very popular Christian apologist / theologian, Wes Huff. You may have seen him on the Joe Rogan podcast. So Dan goes in and he makes his case against Luke. Even Matthew catches a stray in there. And he does this over a couple of videos. And to be honest, his take is pretty jarring, especially if you're not as familiar with the evidence that's out there, or you don't know how to unpack what exactly he's talking about, then it can look like a pretty serious problem that we're dealing with here. Hi, I'm the Nats Theologian. I'm here to help simplify where science and Christianity meet. All right, so we just saw this super clip of Dan talking about all of these contradictions. And ironically, I feel like he both overstates and somehow understates the case for this contradiction. I think one of the first big problems that we come across is just the idea of a contradiction in general. I think a lot of people throw that term, including Dan, around, but we don't really stop and define what that winds up being. And as far as I'm aware, in at least this particular part of the video series, he never stops and actually defines what a contradiction is. And if you're not really tuning in here, I think that's easy to miss, because he really confuses the idea of a contradiction with really a problem or a conflict. And he provides an example in the Bible of what he believes is a contradiction, but he really fails to show how this winds up mapping on to the actual format of a contradiction. There's a particular form to it. And I think this is important because the idea of a contradiction is a really robust idea within philosophy and logic. You have different kinds of contradictions. You have strict and formal contradictions, material contradictions, metaphysical contradictions. So he uses that idea and he throws around this concept, but in a way that is really just melting it into the idea of a problem or a conflict. Now, in looking at the content here, I think he succeeds in explaining how this example presents a problem, and fair enough, but he never really shows how this problem rises to the level of a contradiction. And since he never points us to the idea, or the definition of a contradiction, this just leaves a gap for the audience to assume that the problem is best classified as such, as a contradiction. And I double checked both of the videos, and he only brings up contradiction at the beginning and at the end. So he bookends his videos with that rhetoric, but he doesn't do the legwork to actually justify his claim. And so we might say, okay, all right, so the issue is not at the level of severity that Dan makes it out to be, but it does still seem to be a problem. So what's the nature of this problem? Now, Dan goes in and he really makes the case that there isn't corroborating evidence for some of the claims in this passage, and he really hones in on a particular passage. Now, lack of corroborating evidence doesn't mean that there is no evidence. It just means that the evidence that we might be looking for to help the evidence that we have isn't there. But lack of corroborating evidence doesn't mean wrong, and it certainly doesn't mean contradiction. But to his point, there does seem to be a problem with the timeline.
Because Luke says that John the Baptist was at least conceived during the days of Herod, and Jesus would have been born just a few months after the birth of John the Baptist. So Luke is placing Jesus' birth, if not during the reign of Herod, within about 6 to 9 months of the death of Herod. Nowhere near 6 CE, when Quirinius conducts his census of Judea.
So let's take stock of what we see in the gospel account here. So essentially, Caesar declares a census, the census entails that the Jews return to the lands of their ancestors. This particular event is what draws Mary and Joseph to go to the city of David, which we call Bethlehem. Jesus is born. Herod winds up hearing about this and then conducts a slaughter of boys 2 years and younger. Herod dies shortly thereafter, circa 4 BC. Sometime later, Quirinius is governor and holds a census in 6 AD. And then Quirinius is governor specifically of Syria. Now, what the issue Dan raises is that the census in question is a census that happens in 6 AD, which is roughly a decade or so after when Jesus' birth would have been. So if Herod gives this order before he dies, so if he dies in 4 BC, and he gives the order to have boys 2 years and younger slaughtered, then backtrack 2, maybe 3 years to about 7 BC, somewhere in that ballpark. That's where we wind up having Jesus' birth needing to be based on that timeline. But again, if we note Quirinius, then he's not really in the picture as governor until 6 AD. So that's where we have this issue. Dan takes this as saying, okay, so Luke probably got it wrong. He's probably not historical. This is an issue. Boom, contradiction. But this alleged problem makes a few assumptions. So one of the assumptions is that there's only one census that we're referring to here. Another one is that a Roman census is announced, starts, and ends fairly quickly. And then even that Roman censuses kind of have the same processes or same sort of rules that apply for both citizens and non-citizens. And then the last assumption is that Quirinius is in the same position at the time of Jesus' birth as well as at the time of the 6 AD census. And then we have another in 14 AD. We know that from Res Gesti Divi Augusti, section 8. We also have the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, indicating an Egyptian census cycle of 14 years. If we were to extend that back, that gives us a perfect match for both the 6 AD and an 8 BC census. We'll take a look at that 8 BC census date a little bit later. Then Dan goes into the weeds on the Greek, and that's not really problematic. In fact, I think it's helpful. He cites his sources and provides the manuscript evidence, which I think is really great for us to be able to see exactly what he sees. But I'm not really sure what that gets us in either direction. Even his reference to Darrell Bach, who is a conservative scholar, reveals that. Daniel Wallace, also a conservative scholar, similarly notes that phrasing in that passage has the same kind of options. I think, though, what deserves more attention here is the role of Quirinius. Quirinius was governor of Syria in 6 AD, and Luke gets this detail correct, at least in the sense of governing. Now, Dan shows that the Greek word that references Quirinius' governing is hegemontas.
And here is the text in Greek, and I've put the relevant words in the red boxes. On top, avti, apographi, on the bottom, proti, egeneto.
So we very selectively highlighted different words that kind of don't do anything for us, and a word that could do a lot for us is skipped.
He is assuming that meant Quirinius was governor in his passage. But hegemonouantas is not a title here, and Luke doesn't note this as a title. In the Greek, it's the past participle governing. So plausible and not merely just possible scenarios that Quirinius assisted in the 8 BC census. We can look and see that Quirinius was given the title of consul in 12 BC, and then Josephus even writes that Quirinius had been consul, and we see that in Antiquities 17.13.5 as well as 18.1.1. So then Quirinius later serves as governor of Syria when Archelaus' reign winds up ending. So you have multiple governors between 13 BC and 1 AD of Syria, and they each serve about 3.5 years, and even still, the governor from 4 BC to 1 AD is completely unknown. We don't know who that was. Now, I'm not advocating that Quirinius was that 4 BC to 1 AD governor, just that given the churn that we see in the leadership there, if a census were to take place at 8 BC, and one did take place at 8 BC, it is not a stretch at all that Rome would have dispatched officials to help administer it. And it's not something that would necessarily nuke the economy, as Dan puts it, especially when you have these cycles of censuses occurring. So we have this 8 BC date for Caesar's census, and we have a sort of fluid dynamic leadership set up in Syria. So it's not unlikely that Rome could have sent a competent leader, then consul Quirinius, and even more so if Quirinius worked with Herod, who often attempted to rule and have policy with some consideration for Judaism, then it's possible that the census in this client kingdom could have been done with respect to the 12 tribes of Israel. So if Quirinius was running the show for the census, then it makes sense to say that Quirinius was leading during the time of Jesus' birth, instead of saying that he was governor at the time. There's also some debate as to whether an inscription known as Lapis Tibertinus refers to Quirinius. I think this is the anonymous inscription Dan is talking about. This inscription mentions an official that served as proconsul a second time. Now, if Quirinius served as governor twice, then he would have been in power as early as 4 BC, right at the cusp of Herod's death. I still think that even if that's a solution, that we are kind of slightly out of sync time-wise, since we would need Quirinius in there just a bit earlier to have some hand in the census in order to be named in Luke 2:2 as such. But regardless, the inscription means that we have incomplete records for leadership in this region at this time. And again, even if Quirinius did not serve 2 terms with the title of governor or proconsul, it's plausible he, being a capable consul, could have been commissioned to oversee or administer the census. Ultimately, for anybody on either side of this issue, we just don't have a lot of records for censuses in general. And again, the leadership record isn't airtight. So if we can't have some definition on, given the facts that we do know, then we care about what's plausible. So given the lack of records, we have some room for speculation within the boundaries of what we do have. And of course, anything is possible, but we don't really care about what's possible or what's merely possible. Since apologists take the evidence and follow it where it leads, very much unlike the gross mischaracterization that Dan makes, we can hold a plausible model with an open hand and be open to what future data could either support or rule out. Dan's comments on apologist methods are a video all on its own, and he continues to make videos that contain these jabs at apologetics. But I'll just, without going into all the particulars on how he's just wrong there, I'll give a few counterexamples. But for one, myself, but in no particular order, you have apologists that do make very intellectually honest arguments and claims and support them with good data. A few of those would be people like William Lane Craig, J. Warner Wallace, Greg Kokel, Sean McDowell, Ann Schleiman, Lenny Esposito, and so many more that don't fall into this terribly inaccurate picture that Dan paints for apologetics. So this video probably didn't have as much science as I would like or you would like, but I think it highlights a common objection that gets raised, that there are contradictions in the Bible or contradictions somewhere in Christianity. So hopefully helping walk through what that kind of a claim would look like and seeing whether or not it really holds up to the standard of what a contradiction is, I think is still a bit helpful.